I realized something reading this book that I'm almost ashamed to admit. I thought in my head I knew how to make good decisions. Truth of the matter is, I actually had no idea what really went into making a clear and definite great decision. You see, more times than I'd like to admit, I'm frequently giving up what I want most for what I want today. And the truth of the matter is, you probably are in the same boat. I thought making better decisions was all about being rational, and I'm pretty rational. At least I thought I was. And I'm also pretty logical. Again, at least I thought I was. Truth is, there is way more that goes into this than meets the eye. Because for one, there's interior forces that are at play constantly that are in the way of us making better decisions. There's the fact that we don't know the process to do that. But before we even get to any of that, let's first talk about what the author goes into at the very end of the book. And in my opinion, we probably should have started with. The book, of course, I'm talking about is Clear Thinking by Shane Parrish. See, at the end of this book, he talks about something that Stoics have been talking about for thousands of years, and people like Ryan Holiday has been talking about for quite a long time. It's this idea of memento mori, remember you will die. There's this interesting thought experiment he goes over at the end of the book. He says, if you want to make better decisions, you start with the end in mind. If you want to solve a very complex maze, you start at the end and work your way backwards. And the concept is really simple. The thought experiment, man, you can see my whole leg. Let me pull down my shorts real quick so you don't think I'm wearing booty shorts. But it's the concept of memento mori is pretty simple. And the thought experiment goes like this. Imagine you're 80, 90 years old and you're laying on your deathbed. What are the regrets that you have about the decision that's at hand? What are the things that you wish you would have spent more time on? And I'm willing to bet it's probably not the fact that it didn't work enough. I'm willing to bet that the thing that you probably do regret is not going after the goal that you set out for, that you didn't marry the girl, that you didn't go all in on the business idea that you maybe had, or take the job that scared you a little bit. These regrets constantly are plaguing us day in and day out, and we can avoid them by having a little bit of hindsight. And that's what memento mori is there for. The reflection on the fact that we're not here forever, and ultimately we only have a short period of time to take action. Once we do this, then everything else that Shane talks about makes a little bit more sense. But you remember earlier how I mentioned that there's these interior forces that are constantly in the way of us making better decisions. There's two that really stood out to me, two that I know for a fact that I'm constantly plagued with. The first we've all heard of is the confirmation bias. It's the idea that we just seek out the information that we want to hear so we can prove that we're right. So in business, this happens all the time. You have an offer, an idea, a service that you think will work. And instead of doing your due diligence and doing the marketing research and asking some people, you go ahead and do it. And instead, when you do the research, you're just looking for confirmation that people actually do want it. Problem is, when you release the service or offer, nobody buys it. The other problem on a personal level is arguments with your significant other. Come on, let's be honest here. We've all done it. Okay, we look and search for reasons why we'll be right in an argument with our significant other. We'll Google reasons why I am right and see what comes up and use that information against your significant other, proving that you're right, when in fact there's plenty of other articles and studies that show the contrary to that. The second fallacy, or the second bias that we all have, that I realize that I really struggle with and I got to pay attention to, is called the sunk cost fallacy. It's the idea that the more you spend time on something, or money, resources in general, the more you double down on that thing. And again, I can't help but think back to, again, business. The decision is failing. You chose to do an offer, you chose to do a product or a service, and again, you sink all of the money into it. And instead of realizing that, man, I made a bad decision here, you double down, you triple down, and next thing you know, the business is, well, bankrupt. We've all kind of been there to some capacity. Or, again, let's take a more personal route. You are with someone you cannot stand. You don't like them, but yet and still you stay with them because you've been with them for years, or you've spent tons of money into it, or you're already married and all of these things. And by the way, to be clear, before someone comes after me or my wife sees this, I am not talking about my wife. I'm just talking about friends I've heard be in the situation. To be clear. But once we get through all of the fallacies, it's time to start talking about the decision-making process. Turns out there's an actual process to this. The first is identifying the problem. The funny thing is, we all do this thing where we come up with solutions before we truly understand the problem. And he has this great example of a dog shelter that explains this perfectly. The dog shelter assumes that the problem that they're trying to solve for is the fact that nobody's adopting dogs. They have tons of dogs going unadopted, and they need to figure out a way to get more families to adopt dogs until they realize that's not really the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the fact that people even surrender their dogs in the first place. So they did something interesting. Instead of trying to come up with more campaigns to get more people to adopt dogs, they said, what if we just tried to get people to keep the dog that they're trying to surrender? And so what they would do is you'd bring in the dog saying, hey, I can't take this dog. And then ask you a simple question. Do you love the dog? Do you want to keep the dog? Yes, of course I want to keep the dog. Well, then what's the problem? Turns out I just don't have the money, or I don't have the resources to get the surgery that we need for him, or, we don't have enough food. And they would go, hey, what if we paid for that? Would that help? Well, a lot of times they end up keeping the dog, which significantly shrank the amount of dogs they need to adopt. This is a great example of why understanding the problem at hand is key. Once we understand the problem, though, it's time to explore possibilities. Once we get to this stage, we cannot be in a silo. We can't talk to the same people about the same problems. We have to find the experts in the area. And by the way, it's pretty hard to find the experts. And again, in the book, he details out how to find them. But once you do, it's time to start coming up with all the possibilities, all the different ways the problem can be solved, leaving out your confirmation bias, if at all possible. Then we evaluate the options. You put all the solutions on a single page and you start to brainstorm and almost imagine yourself making the decision. And again, in the book, Shane details out this really interesting way he makes decisions. There's a process for evaluating your options and making a decision. And one of the processes that he talks about, or the frameworks to make sure he doesn't make a mistake, he very rarely makes mistakes in the same day that it's presented to him. And that's especially if the cost of the decision is very, very high. If it costs a lot of money to execute on it, if it's going to take a lot of time and effort to reverse the decision that you made, you're going to want to spend a lot of time thinking about it. On the flip side, though, if it's a decision that could be easily reversed or doesn't cost a lot of money, then just hurry up and make the decision. Not a big deal. But the way that we evaluate the options is to live as if we've made the decision already. What is it like waking up the next day and saying, man, I made the decision and here's why. How do you feel? And ultimately, sometimes I'm on the right path and I feel great about the decision. But sometimes you realize that it was not the right move to make in the first place. And good news is you never really made the decision. So it's time to pivot and make the next one. Then finally, of course, you make the damn decision. Too often, there is a downside to clear thinking. There's a downside to this decision-making process, and that's sometimes people spend way too much time making a decision. They evaluate every single possible scenario, but then never pull the trigger, and that is not really that great either. So as we're going through this process, I realized the importance of, one, creating a little bit more time before I make the decision, to allow myself to think about all the possible scenarios that can happen, but also to make sure that I have a deadline. I have to make a decision by a certain time, and then if I don't, either A, it's not that really important anyway, or B, I'm just scared. That's okay too. So there is one more analogy or framework that he comes up with in this book that I want to kind of address, that I think, honestly, if more entrepreneurs did this, or really any of us did it, we would make better decisions. He calls it bullets before cannons. So imagine you have a ship and you're out there and you see an enemy ship approaching you. And by the way, it helps if you imagine this is like back in the day when we didn't have crazy firepower. But anyway, we have cannons and we have bullets. But the truth of the matter is we only have a certain amount of gunpowder to go around. So what do? Do you shoot the cannon immediately, only to realize that you're pretty far off from the target and you run out of gunpowder pretty fast? Or do you shoot the bullets first to gauge how close you are and then the cannon? So again, I think about this in terms of business all the time. So instead of going, hey, I'm going to dump tons of time, money, energy into an offer, and then find out nobody wants to buy it, maybe you start with a small section of your email list and say, hey, if I made this, would you want to buy it? And only until they buy it do you start making it. When we do this, we shortcut the pain of dumping time, money, and energy into it, but we actually kind of validate our initial thought process of, hey, people would actually want this. I done this recently, actually, with a new offer that I have coming out. I'm pretty excited about it because, again, I waited until I made sure people actually wanted it. If nothing else, this book helped me figure out this one important thing. In order to get what I want most and not constantly be making wrong decisions or shortcutting what I want most for what I want today, you have to think clearly. And there's a process to it. And unless you want to be on your deathbed wondering, man, why did I make that dumbass decision? maybe you should get the book. But do you have a process that's different than this in terms of decision making? Do you have a process for making hard decisions? And if so, I want to hear about that in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I'll catch you in the next video.